So our next panel is going to talk about the current immigration policy landscape. So there's a lot to discuss there. So I'm going to invite Liam Adams to come up. Liam is a religion reporter at the Tennessean, USA Today Network. And shout out to the Tennesseans. There are not that many religion reporters left, and we're glad that you're one of them, Liam. And thank you for your work. Yeah, sure. And so you can, and the panelists, if you can please come up, and Liam will introduce them.
Afternoon, everybody. Thanks for being here. As Glenn mentioned, I'm Liam. I'm the religion reporter at the Tennessean. Our office is just down the road, so it's great to have folks from, in our backyard, but then, all over. So I'm just going to really quickly introduce our panelists. We have a wonderful group here, and then we'll kind of dive into your questions. So right next to me is Representative Reid Ribble, who represented Wisconsin's 8th Congressional District from 2011 to 2017. And next to Representative Ribble, we have Chelsea Sobolik, and Chelsea is the Director of Government Relations for World Relief, one of the lead organizations of the Evangelical Immigration Table and the country's largest evangelical refugee resettlement agency, the reason why many of us are here today. Next to her, we have Krista Kartson, and Krista is the Vice President of Community Building and Engagement for Welcome.us, equipping institutional partners and sponsors with the information and resources to do what they do best, welcome newcomers and help them thrive. So we're having a conversation about sort of high-level policy, but I thought it would be helpful to start. And the way we're just going to kind of do it is I'm going to throw out a question and they're going to jump in as they feel equipped to answer. But as we're talking about this higher level policy, I think it's important to talk just sort of about the work that they do and sort of experientially how this policy has affected their work. And so I'm just going to just start and ask, what is a policy change this year that has changed the work you do in a major way? And if you can sort of walk us through in real time how you responded to that policy change.
On this side with Welcome.us, I have to tell you a little bit more about how it started before I get to how it's going. So bear with me. We were founded in 2021, and our mission is to help bring more Americans in, get them involved in the work of welcoming, and that looks like different ways, especially right now. But in 2021, it looked like getting churches and communities involved in supporting the 80,000 Afghan allies who were on military bases all across our country. And I wasn't with Welcome.us at that time. I was with an evangelical organization called Samaritan's Purse. And I led their program, and 1,500 churches raised their hands to resettle and welcome Afghan allies into our communities. And since then, that program, it's called private sponsorship. And you heard a little bit about it because Kim is a private sponsor from our previous panel. She sponsored Kevinson. And Kim isn't alone in that. Through the various programs that have existed since then, 2 million Americans have raised their hands to participate in the work of private sponsorship across 12,000 zip codes. And these are churches and communities from Hartsville, South Carolina to Hartford, Connecticut, all across the political spectrum, all across the faith spectrum. Welcome.us is not a faith-based organization. We are a nonpartisan organization as well, but it's really clear to see that churches have been leading the way in welcoming our allies and refugees and people who have fled their homes. And so now we've got Americans all across the political spectrum, all across the country, in rural areas and suburban and urban areas, who signed up to welcome a family because many of whom, out of their spiritual conviction to love our neighbors and to help be a bridge to safety for people who have fled their homes. And now with policies that started this year, many of those families are at risk of losing their status. And so as sponsors, we have found ourselves in a situation of we knew how to care for people well, we knew how to secure apartments, how to help them find jobs, to connect them with English language courses. And now we're in the spot of being advocates when we never signed up for that. Many weren't ever political to begin with, but we found ourselves of being a good friend now means being a voice for our friends. And so now Welcome.us still engages these communities, and I believe welcomers, specifically Christian welcomers, we're the best situated to be this voice because sponsors are already really adept at cross-cultural communication. We welcomed people from another culture. We can speak clearly and with passion, but also we're very pragmatic people. And we also are very invitational in engaging across political spectrums. We stick to the facts, stick to our experiences, and so it's equipping sponsors and welcomers not just to speak, but also we're launching a new workshop around how do we also listen well to our neighbors, because having connected conversations includes listening as well.
My honest answer to this question is what policy on immigration and foreign assistance hasn't impacted us? But I will hone in on two. Liam, you mentioned that we're the largest evangelical refugee resettlement here in the U.S. We're also the humanitarian arm of the National Association of Evangelicals. So around the world, we're serving people. We're serving in contexts like Sudan, Haiti, DRC, Ukraine. Obviously, the through line in those countries is some of the worst conflict and humanitarian disaster in the world. But then here in the U.S., we're serving refugees and people seeking safety here. So the two things I want to hone in on quickly is refugee resettlement and mass deportations. Candidate Trump at the time had told us that he was going to, on day one, suspend the refugee resettlement program. And we prepared for that. We had, made a lot of plans for what that could look like, would look like. While it was absolutely heartbreaking, it wasn't surprising because he had told us he was going to do that. I will say one of the things, there's a number of ongoing things. There's litigation, which we have not joined any of the cases, but one of the things that has stood out to me as I'm in DC, I'm interacting with lawmakers and their staff every day, but my World Relief colleagues who are on the ground, being the hands and feet of Jesus, World Relief made a commitment to do our very best to serve people to the very best of our ability. And that has stood out to me. And I've gotten to take those stories to lawmakers and to their staff. And I share those oftentimes in tears because, it's very easy. And I have my iPad because I have statistics that I don't want to mess up. And it's very easy to talk in, there's 123 million people on the move today. There's tens of millions, all these big statistics. And I use these, we've all used them. But it's very, we connect with stories, right? And statistics are important, but we connect with stories. And so I want us to remember that each one of these statistics are people made in God's image. The pause of the refugee resettlement program, initially it was pitched as a 90-day pause and it would be reviewed. The 90-day suspension has been continued to be suspended and suspended. I will say every year the president is supposed to issue his presidential determination on the refugee numbers. The deadline is today. The deadline for other things in Congress is also today, if you're watching. But we're anticipating that coming down, and maybe I can talk about some of our work on what we're trying to do publicly on advocating for that. The second thing I want to talk about that impacts our work is mass deportations. So World Relief's mission is to boldly engage the world's greatest crises in partnership with the local church. We do that around the world, and we do that here in the U.S. in partnership with the local church means that we are serving our brothers and sisters alongside our brothers and sisters, and we of course serve anyone regardless of their faith background. But we did a report this year with the NAE, with the U.S. Council of Catholic Bishops, called the One Body report, and we looked at the impacts of mass deportation on our Christian brothers and sisters here in the U.S. This report found that at the end of 2024, more than 10 million Christians are vulnerable to deportation, accounting for roughly 80% of all people who are at risk for deportation. And another 7 million U.S. citizen Christians live in households of those at risk of deportation. Overall, 1 in 12 Christians in the U.S., including 1 out of every 18 evangelical Christians and 1 out of 5 Catholics, are vulnerable to deportation themselves or could lose a family member. I'm not going to ask you to raise your hand, but based off these statistics and based off of why you've all come to this convening because in some way, shape, or form you care about immigrants, you care about our neighbors, you care about engaging well in these issues. I'm not going to ask you to raise your hand, but each one of us knows people who have been deported, who are at risk of being deported, who have been detained, and I think we're all fighting and advocating and doing our best. But I could probably take up the whole 30 minutes myself talking about policies that have impacted our neighbors, but I will land the plane there.
Well, and this might be a great segue, and I'll actually start with you because I think there have been, just from what I've reported on and some of my peers in the religion reporting space about some of the religious liberty implications of, people of faith and lawmakers of faith who, are involved with faith groups that are doing ministry, serving refugees and immigrants. And yet some of the policy is sort of, as the critics would say, working against religious liberty. And so that's going to be the topic of my next question, which I'm going to kind of merge a couple because there's been a huge conversation about the religious liberty implications around the suspension of the refugee resettlement program. And I'm hoping that some of you that are working in that space can speak to that. But then there's the other piece around sort of ICE activity and the question of, ICE with the rescission of the protected spaces sort of guidance of whether ICE can conduct detention operations within spaces like churches and schools and other things like that. So I was wondering if you can kind of educate a little bit the audience on some of these policies at the federal level and the religious liberty implications and concerns that are coming from that.
Okay, most of these policies that are currently being enforced are not actually law, other than the president's use of as Barack Obama would say, I've got a phone and I've got a pen. And so there's a fair amount of executive orders, and it's pretty difficult to keep up with how fast and furious they're coming. Now, when it comes on the religious liberty side and the Department of Homeland Security, going into a public school, I think it's likely. Particularly high schools and private universities, I think it could and is happening around the country. Going into church is a whole nother matter. I could possibly see ICE raids happening on churches that are advertising to specific people groups, Haitians, for example, or Hispanics, for example, or Koreans, because they're actually promoting churches that will deliver those messages and ministry in their language. So they could likely become a target. Now, I think it is a bit unlikely that Kristi Noem would be pushing that in the short term. But there is a quota that they're seeking to reach with the number of deportations. Remember, at the Republican convention, they're all waving their mass deportation signs at the convention. And so when they start running out of people at Home Depot or wherever they're going, the local roofing company or dairy farm, at some point they're going to start to go a bit deeper. And this is where the evangelical church needs to stand up because we're dealing with the First Amendment to the U.S. Constitution. And by the way, the first few words of the First Amendment are, Congress shall make no law. It would have been nice if they stopped at that point, but without regard to that, Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. And so the idea of ministering to refugees, asylees, immigrants is core to the mission and the religious beliefs of that particular body. And so I think if there was a raid into a church, it would probably immediately be challenged in the courts on the religious liberty side of things. And I hope that it would hold up. As you stop and think about it, I'll be very brief with this statement because it's going to be controversial, but that's okay. The evangelical church in America spends billions of dollars sending missionaries around the globe. God spent nothing to send those same people right to us.
And I'll just add to this piece about the ICE activity in churches. We haven't seen evidence of a ICE raid in a church yet, and the protected spaces policy is being challenged in the courts. But we have seen stories, news reports of ICE agents, for example, waiting after church services to detain people. So Chelsea and Krista, I was wondering if you guys could speak a little more to the refugee resettlement piece and religious liberty concerns there as well.
Absolutely. Not to reference another report that we have done, but I believe it was the end of last year, we released a report with an organization called Open Doors US called State of the Golden Door. We would probably rename it if we did it this year because refugee resettlement has been largely suspended. But at the time, it was called State of the Golden Door, and we were looking at the intersection of refugees and Christians. President Trump, during his first term and during his second term, has stated that religious liberty, religious freedom issues are a administrative priority. And so we're really doing our best to remind him and the administration that one of the tools in his toolbox is refugee resettlement. One of the criteria for being a refugee is persecution on behalf of your faith. And so we're really trying to hone in on that intersection of people persecuted for their faith and refugee resettlement. The numbers, the most recent numbers we have, we know, I've been following what's happening in Nigeria very closely. I have a number of actually clergy at my church who are Nigerians. It's very dear to my heart, but we see that persecution on behalf of faith is on a rise around the world. 1 in 7 Christians around the world are persecuted because of their faith. And while there's things we can do, globally in our foreign policy to help it be safe for people to stay in country or in region on behalf, or if they're persecuted on behalf of their faith. The reality is for a number of people, they'll never be able to go home. Pastor Ara was, I slipped out for a little bit, so I don't know if you told this story, but he had come to DC over the summer because of congregate members from Iran who were detained, who were our Christians. And he and I went around the Hill together and met with lawmakers. And every meeting, it just really stood out to me through tears. He told the story, your own story, which is incredibly powerful. But he was there to advocate for people whose voices weren't being heard in the halls of Congress, of Christians who, if they were sent back to Iran, would face horrific things or death. And so I think it's really important for us to understand that intersection. I think, if you're in this room, I think you probably understand that intersection, but broadening that out to lawmakers of faith who might not naturally see that intersection, or people in our congregation who do care about Christian persecution, and we can say there are ways that we can help. So I mentioned in my first answering the first question, the presidential determination is anticipated, and there have been rumors floating around about numbers and populations, but we sent a letter advocating with a number of folks advocating for religious minorities to be prioritized. We also have a Christian statement on refugee resettlement on our website. Don't know that you can search it, but we're really trying to help Christians who naturally care about religious freedom to also care about our brothers and sisters around the world, and to remind them that we, as a U.S. government, have tools and levers at our disposal to help brothers and sisters find safety and refuge here in the U.S.
Krista, if you want to speak to that, and then I'll ask another question for Melissa about some state legislation.
I'd love to. I don't have a report, but I have a story to share. So I was out in the countryside in the Midwest U.S. with my mom for just get away from work for a little bit, enjoy the country air. And we did that. And, if you could picture a main street, there's basically corn and wheat fields all around, but there's a main street, there's shops with some woodworking, some apple pies, and just beautiful vista. And we're looking down the street, wandering around, and we pass a Ukrainian restaurant. And we're like, wow, in the middle of nowhere, what is this? We can get pierogies. This is fantastic. You could get borscht and then hot apple pie afterward for dessert. So we go inside and we ask, we order, we want to support this local business, and we order and we ask, how did you get here to this, this countryside? And the woman said, we were recently sponsored. We were sponsored a couple years ago. And there's a whole community of Ukrainians out here that churches have sponsored and welcomed us here. And they talked about the generosity of the church, and they were only there in safety because of the local church. And so I never connected with the church out here before, so I emailed the pastor. And I told him, thank you for your service, for the community. We heard high praise for the work that you're doing and the efforts that you're putting in. And he wrote me back, and I think this testimony of this pastor is the best way to talk about how Christians see refugee resettlement as such an integral part of exercising our faith in this country. He said, part of our mission is supporting our Ukrainian friends, but more broadly, our church sees us trying to help and serve refugees as part of our Christian mission in following Jesus, who calls his followers to care for the least of these. We certainly see refugees as part of this call, even as we also help meet the needs in our local community. And he goes on to talk about how they recently partnered with a local church to sponsor an Afghan family also. So this out of the overflow in the least likely place in the Midwest that we would think about refugees being welcomed and invited, these folks were only there because of the invitation and the generosity and the hospitality of the local church, exercising our faith.
And I'm going to invite you guys, I'm going to ask one or two more questions of our panelists, but invite you to submit some questions. I can see your questions on my phone, and so would love to be able to look at some of those as our panelists are continuing the discussion. We're talking a lot about federal policy here, but it's also important to talk about state legislation. And it's been a very eventful year here in Tennessee. And so, Melissa, I'll start with you on this question, but then if other people want to add any other insight to offer to this. But so, for example, Tennessee passed a law this session that criminalizes churches and charities from, quote unquote, harboring undocumented people, including providing shelter for them in exchange for financial benefit. This law is currently being challenged in court. And a colleague of mine reported recently that the Tennessee Attorney General's office said it will not pledge not to prosecute churches that, quote unquote, provide shelter to undocumented people. We do have 1 or 2 minutes before we're going to turn it over to audience questions, but I don't know if y'all had any more thoughts related to what Melissa was sharing.
One of the things I hear a lot, and I speak at a lot of conferences like this, and I teach advocacy, how do people approach their members of Congress and try to be effective. But the thing I hear so frequently from the Christian audiences that I speak to is, well, we didn't elect a pastor to be president of the United States. And I said, well, that's true. I'm totally fine with you not electing a pastor to be president of the United States. But our behavior as Christians, we're very specific what God expects from us. You know, the fruit of the Spirit is love, joy, peace, gentleness, goodness, meekness, kindness, patience, and self-control. These are the ways that we should be reacting to our neighbor, whether they're here in an undocumented fashion, whether they're here as a refugee or asylee. At a bare minimum, as a Christian man and woman, we should express the kindness and gentleness and meekness that the Spirit in us should be prompting us to do. And some of the more hateful language that we're seeing and what the state of Tennessee is doing, what their legislators are doing, are responding to this populist nationalist moment that the country is in. And so I wish they would stand up to it a bit more than they are, but at the end of the day, they're following or representing the voices that they're hearing the loudest. And unfortunately, when you're a member of Congress, the voice you often hear is the loudest, most angry voice. And so it's natural for them to respond to it.
Well, that's a great point, a great way to segue into multiple questions that we're getting. Feel free to submit a few more questions. But so one of them was, what are the most strategic ways to reach out to your local representatives? I do have another follow-up question that's directly for you, but that was one of the questions about just how to reach out to folks best.
They're not going to have anything to do for a few weeks. I mean, so
take advantage of the moment.
Yeah, my guess is, I mean, congressional staff will be pared down a bit, but members of Congress are just sitting there twiddling their thumbs. For the most part, they would like to hear from constituents, quite frankly. And Republicans, which most of them are here in Tennessee, are at home. They're not in D.C. The Democrats are in D.C., but the Republicans are here because the House of Representatives isn't in session. I would be reaching out to their offices and asking to sit down with them. And my advice is be on time, be direct, be honest, be brief, and be gone. If you do those things, you will have an audience that will hear you. And it really doesn't matter if you're talking to the member of Congress or someone on their staff. A lot of times people say they have to talk to the member of Congress, but a lot of times the staff is actually doing the real work behind the scenes. So you shouldn't be bothered if you're speaking to someone on staff. They're probably as important or even more so than this. They just need to hear from you because what they're hearing is the other side. And so if the church is quiet on this, and they have a tendency to be, then members of Congress think the only voices that matter are the ones that they're hearing, which are clamoring for more deportations.
Do any of you have thoughts on the reaching out to lawmakers? And
Can I tell a quick story? And also as a former Capitol Hill staffer, I'm just kidding. This past summer, World Relief did virtual advocacy days. We invited people, it was all virtual, but we invited people to join meetings with their member of Congress or staff member. And multiple people or multiple staff on our advocacy team would staff these meetings, make sure they were brief, direct, all the things. What struck me was probably 80 to 90% of the people who joined, and we had several hundred people join, had never, ever in their whole life reached out to their member of Congress. They never called, they never emailed, they had never done a meeting. So we did a lot of prep with them. The second thing that really stood out to me is, and they self-disclosed to us and they self-disclosed in their meetings, the vast majority of people who joined our virtual advocacy days voted for President Trump. And they said this, they said, I voted for President Trump. I didn't vote for children being torn apart from their parents, for Christians to be, I didn't vote for this. And they were so direct and honest. And it really stood out to me because I think, I say that as a way of encouraging you that there are people who, and I spend too much time on Twitter sometimes, but there are people who are waking up and saying, I didn't want this. And so they are using their voices. And I think one of the important things for us in this room is to encourage more people to speak up and to use their voices and to reach out to their member.
I could add another story. So you all probably know this, but I didn't learn this until I was like one of those people who wasn't part of advocacy. That's even like a scary word still for me. But what I've learned through my sponsor journey is that our representatives have local offices in our states, and they have constituency services, people who are paid to hear our cases. And even if we have a pending inquiry with a federal agency, really any federal agency, they can help investigate that on our behalf. And so what some of our biggest group of folks who we work with are Americans who sponsored Ukrainians, for example. And Ukrainians were given the humanitarian parole timeline to come to the US for 2 years. And then if the pathway is still open, they can apply for a re-parole to extend their time. But that program has been paused. But last month, we've seen sponsors who have been engaging with their constituency services folks get that re-parole approval for people. And so that's another, it's not just the DC policy folks, it's also if you specifically have a case that you're working with specifically, you can work with your constituency services office as well.
I'm really quick question for you, Chelsea, and then another question for you. So one of them was, how can we get access to the data you're sharing?
Both reports are on our website. So
does that satisfy the question? Hopefully it does.
one state of the one body report, and then state of the Golden Door.
Okay,
I'm mixing them.
Great. So to Congressman Ribble, how did attitudes about immigration change in the Republican caucus during your years in Congress? We got a few more minutes.
Yeah, it evolved from, I would say, 25 to 30 members of Congress being very anti-immigrant in 2011. I was elected in 2010. And by 2016, I would say 50% to 60% were anti-immigrant. And what I mean by that, it was even anti-legal immigration. It was, they hide behind, well, I just don't want any illegals here. They hide behind that. But when you probe a bit deeper, you find out that they would like to restrict all forms of immigration. And the country is facing a demographics cliff right now with declining birth rates. And so we need a vibrant young workforce of workers across all trades. And so they need to learn arithmetic a bit better, particularly if you want to fix Social Security and Medicare. We need more people paying into the system, not less. But it degraded, it got worse. And then here by 2024, like I said, at the Republican convention, they're holding signs of mass deportations at the Republican convention. That tells you where this nationalist movement has gone. And I don't call it a Republican movement because that party doesn't exist in its original form or what it was 25, 30 years ago. That party's gone. It's now a nationalist populist party. And so they're doing what nationalists do.
All right, we got room for, I think, time for one more question from the audience, and if just some really quick answers. So if Congress is waiting for the White House to speak on immigration reform before acting, what is our pathway to advocate for reform, if not through Congress?
I think the only pathway through real reform is Congress. You actually have to pass a law, because anything the president does by executive order just gets undone by executive order. And so here's the reality, though. The Trump administration actually, outside of Stephen Miller, actually is fairly responsive to the evangelical movement. It was evangelical Protestants that put Donald Trump in the White House, and he's aware of it. The problem is evangelical Protestants are generally unwilling to go and speak their mind in Washington, D.C. And I will tell you, if somebody from Green Bay, Wisconsin flew all the way to Washington, D.C. to talk to me, I made sure I was in that meeting personally. If something bothered that person that much that they were going to spend that kind of money, the least I owed them as their representative was to sit down with them and hear them out. And you will be heard out if you're willing to go. But you need to talk to your member. So I would encourage you all to do that. It's up to you.
1 minute. Any other concluding thoughts for you guys? Okay. Well, thank you so much, all the panelists.